Test, test. Let's see. You guys can probably hear me. I can't hear you. Give me just a second to figure out Zoom. Tom, can you test your mic? I have unmuted you.
Okay, I'm here. I tested it locally and seemed to work fine.
There you go. I can hear you.
Excellent. Loud and clear, I hope?
Loud and clear over here. So we have a few attendees on. I know Jess is over there. If you guys are at your computer, Anna, can you guys type in the chat box if you can hear us both clearly? Okay, Nora, thank you. Loud and clear. Wonderful. And Tom, you're sharing your screen, so that looks to be
Amazing how that works.
all right. Yes.
Okay. Is that now a full screen slide?
It is.
Excellent. With our happy logo that I found on the web.
It's great.
Cool.
Yeah. So would you like for me to, when we start at 1 o'clock, would you like for me to read your bio?
It's sort of customary to at least have some kind of a introduction, and it would be useful for the listeners to have some idea of my perspective.
Yes.
I'll listen in and fill in any blanks as after you're finished.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right.
All right, well, I'm going to go on mute.
Okay.
And then we'll start promptly at 1 o'clock.
I should do that too. Okay.
All right, thanks. Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar today on infant feeding practices and nutrition for early brain development. We are excited that, first of all, to bring you the expertise of Dr. Tom Brenna. I'm going to read you his bio in just a second, but I do want to acknowledge to everyone who's on, we are using a new platform now with our webinars. This started last week with the general session, and so we are all on Zoom. So it looks like people are getting logged in. It's the same functionality as we were using before with Adobe Connect. We can see you, we cannot hear you. We can't see you through video, but we can see that your attendance is present. And so if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type those into the chat box, and I will be monitoring that. And also Dr. Brenna has agreed to answer any questions also at the end. So if you need clarification throughout the presentation, we will do our best to keep up with that in the middle of the presentation, and then there will be some time at the end for specific questions as well. So thank you for joining us. Just get used to the chat panel here so that you know where to type that in when you have a need to communicate with us. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and read Dr. Brenna's bio, and then I'll let Dr. Brenna get started with this information. We're very excited about this topic, and we know you are as well. Tom Brenna is a professor of pediatrics, of human nutrition, and of chemistry at the University of Texas. He's been with UT Austin since 2017, and this is after 27 years as a professor of human nutrition and of food science at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. His group's basic research into the chemical, biochemical, metabolic, genetic, and ecological aspects of fatty acids have had a decisive influence on modern knowledge of these key nutrients. In the 1990s, his research group was among those contributing to the recognition that dietary omega-3 fatty acids are required for proper brain and retinal function in developing infants. And we are so happy to have that information. I know that many of us who work with young infants and families, and those of us who have had babies ourselves, we know the critical importance of that. So thank you, Dr. Brenna, for your group's work on that to help bring that knowledge to us. And his group's work has transformed our understanding of the LCPUFA biochemical pathways and has defined genetic variation central to fatty acid requirements. He is the fourth scientist to be honored with both ASN's Osborne and Mendel Award for outstanding contributions to basic research in nutrition, and the ASN's Robert Herman Award for Advancement of Clinical Nutrition. Thank you so much, Dr. Brenna. I'm gonna kick it over to you now, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks very much, and let me just confirm you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Can we get some attendees just to type in a yes onto that chat box there? And that way we know you've found the chat box, and also we know that you can hear us. So those are coming through. Thank you.
Okay, great. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to speak to a group that is described as this group is, and with my conversations about this webinar, it seems like a group that I would have a natural affinity to based on my previous work at Cornell. As you heard, I was at Cornell in the Division of Nutritional Sciences for 27, really more like 27 and a half years, and in that period, the work I worked in lots of different areas where omega-3s and fat in general was a theme. The concept of that academic unit at Cornell is not only the scientific aspects of things, but also outreach. Cornell's a land-grant institution, and education and outreach are a big part of what was done there, and so that's kind of the culture that I've lived in. So this is something of I hope a natural thing, and I hope there'll be more of it. So I'll get right into it. The work that I've been involved in brain development has developed over a lot of years. Let's see, and look, my slides on my computer will advance. There we go. There's always a conflict of interest slide for all of us science guys, and I give a list right there. And if anybody has questions, let's hold them till later. But this is just a handful of companies I've been involved with. The themes of this presentation will be to describe the role of omega-3s, and I'm going to spend most of the time on omega-3s and where you get omega-3s from, with the understanding that there are other nutrients, and a dear friend of mine started calling certain nutrients brain selective nutrients, and so they expand much more beyond omega-3s. They'd be minerals, iron, selenium, iodine, and a few others. But what I have to say about omega-3s and their food sources will tend to apply in terms of food sources to those other nutrients. And of course, in a 1 hour seminar, I can't cover everything. I also would like to talk a little bit about the current recommendations for fish consumption, fish being the major source of omega-3s and these other brain selective nutrients from public health agencies. I served on the last dietary guidelines committee that developed the recommendations for the U.S. government, and would like to go over a little of that to give you an idea where the government government recommendations stand. And then say a few things about the impact of omega-3 deficit on mental health disorders, which is particularly depression, which is one of those really untold stories that really should be much more prominent in the press and in our common knowledge. So one of the observations I've made over the years, it's almost obligatory and very obvious when you're in the field for a while, is that the messages between heart and brain nutrition seem to be in conflict, particularly when it comes to fat. And we hear a lot about omega-6 versus omega-3 and whether these two are antagonistic and so forth. I would say, however, that the focus of nutrition and nutrition recommendations has been on heart health, and I think in part because of the dramatic consequences of heart disease. I mean, people drop dead as a result of a heart attack, and but with respect to brains and developing brains, there is a subtlety in measuring lower than optimal brain health, and also in measuring mood, and so I think that has come along more slowly. I do, however, believe that there's much evidence that really indicates that they're not in conflict, and what's good for the brain is good for the heart. Good food supports good health, including brain health. Now, I'll also say that my background is in chemistry and also in nutrition. I'm a specialist in lipids, and that's fats and oils, and metabolism, and in foods. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist. But many of my friends are psychologists and psychiatrists, and that's on purpose because I think that the fundamental underlying basic science has to have an outlet in practice and in actual function. So we call that these days translation to the clinic, or really translation to the public, and those folks have a specialty which is important to ultimate function. I like to talk about this this sort of notion of brain health and kind of put it in a bit of perspective by asking a question. It's a bit of a global question, and I ask here on the slide here, what's the most important scientific problem? So imagine every possible scientific problem, every problem that every professor is addressing in every university, and even ones that they haven't addressed yet. So I'll do a multiple choice here. So it might be climate change, it might be population increase, it might be diverting a giant asteroid headed for the Earth, and it might be building the most effective brains. And you can say, well, how do you decide among those various possibilities? And I would cast the question in a little bit different form: on what solution do all problems depend for their solutions? And from that perspective, I think it becomes obvious that it's building the most effective brains. We don't solve problems unless we have brains that work. And so in that sense, building brains is a meta problem. It's a problem that sits on top of all the other problems. We have to fix that one first in order to solve the other ones in the best way. Now, I won't show you very much technical stuff, maybe a little bit, but there may well be people on the call that have some technical nutrition chemistry background. So I throw a slide in here just for their benefit as a reminder. We talk about omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids because of the structure of those molecules, and so I'm showing three structures here on the slides. And Natalie, do you see my arrow? She's probably muted.
Yes, I had to unmute. I do.
Yeah, right, of course. Okay, you can see it. So I just want to be sure. I'm not just pointing myself. Okay, so the reason why scientists call some fatty acids omega-3 and some fatty acids omega-6 is because of these features called double bonds and their position relative to a certain part of the molecule. Omega-6s are 6 carbons in from the back end of the molecule. Omega-3s are 3 carbons in from the back end of the molecule, and that's basically it. That notation or that naming procedure was developed by a scientist in Minnesota called Ralph Holman, who published it in 1963 and claimed to have thought of it in church as he was hearing the preacher talk about Jesus saying, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," and he said, "Yes, that's it. We're going to call it Omega, last letter of the Greek alphabet." So he published it soon afterwards in a chemistry journal in 1963, and we've had it ever since. Nutrition recommendations, and with respect to how we recommend nutrition, really have focused on brawn and not brain. And I, a little bit cynically, but still, my personal opinion is that the history of nutrition recommendations both expressly and implicitly address prevention of premature death. And I'd like to say, afflicting 50-something men, being part of that group, I'm sympathetic to it. But we think about cardiovascular disease, cancer, and then as waistlines expand, we think about diabetes and obesity. That's all brawn and not brain. And in my readings of the next round of the dietary guidelines, with which I'm not involved, at least not yet, it seems like they're going in that same direction. But we've got lots of data that show that omega-6s grow bodies and omega-3s grow brains, and there's a brain there, and we really have to consider both. I don't remember when I first came to this little jingle, as calcium is to the bones, DHA is in the brain. I think it was in connection with my friend Bill Sears, a pediatrician who's written a whole bunch of books on pediatrics, and with which some of you might be familiar. Including this particular book called The Omega-3 Effect, which was supposed to be written at an elementary level. And I would recommend that book for all sorts of interesting things about omega-3s if you become interested in the topic. But I'll try to tell you now why this is true, why as calcium is to the bones, DHA is to the brain, or at least give you some perspective about why I think about it that way, and many of us think about it that way. So here's a concept, and we work a little bit in the world of human evolution, or at least we think about how animals differ from one another and how they adapt to their environments. And I call to your attention the concept of runaway organs. That is, organs that are that seem to be out of proportion out of proportion in some animals compared to all other animals. So you see this animal here with a very long neck, and this guy with a big tongue, and this guy with a huge claw, and this guy has a kind of an organ that has run away from the perspective of chemicals and odorants. And here's this nice long thing on the end of an elephant. And so this is what we would call a runaway organ. Well, I'd like to suggest to you, and I don't know that I would be the first that would say that humans are the animals of a runaway organ, and that is the brain. Our brain is much bigger than the brain of any other terrestrial animal that is nearly our size. And I'd like to illustrate this particularly with respect to the priority of early human development. So that's the first 3 years, and in fact, I'll show you on the next slide, it's more than the first 3 years. It's also in utero. The priority of early human development is the brain. And so I'll click a few times and show you these arrows here. That arrow is the length of the child's forearm, and that arrow is the same length. And you can see that that her forearm is nowhere near the size of mom's forearm. But if I give you two red arrows here, the size of the child's head and the size of mom's head, you'll see that they are nearly the same size. This head is nearly full grown. And that is clear evidence that early human development emphasizes brain growth. Now, obviously, we can't have a brain with all the rest of the body, but it is the brain that that is first and foremost, and there's other evidence along those lines in utero and elsewhere that the brain of humans is preserved. Now, the other thing to sort of note once you realize that is that 60% of the brain's building material is lipid, is fat. We are all, in a sense, fatheads. The brain and neural tissue is the fattiest. The brain is the fattiest organ in the body, apart from adipose tissue, that is the fat around one's waist, for instance. And I want to further press this issue of the size of the brain to give it a little bit of life for people. These are two quite old slides. This one is an old-fashioned cross-section through an animal. You can probably figure out which one it is. And this, of course, is a little bit more new, but still an older version of a cross-section. And I'll show you here with that with this overlay. The size of the human brain relative to the head. Now, when I'm in an audience where I can see the audience, I tell people now that I'm going to give them a quiz, and I'd like them to try to find the brain in this animal. And I ask them to nod if they can find the brain. And I usually don't get very many nods unless I'm in a medical audience, and even then sometimes I don't. So I'll spill the beans and I'll point out that the brain right here in this animal is about that size right there. It's that little thing right there, which among other things tells you why you shouldn't make this guy mad, but also tells you that if the building materials, which really are different for the brain compared to surrounding material, muscle and bone is all about the same kind of stuff, but this is special. This brain is special, and you can see that this animal over here, namely humans, have a greater requirement for building materials for the brain. In the early perinatal period, we can look at the way the brain grows. And what I'm plotting on this slide, this is a very old slide that comes from 1992, a study by the late, great Manuela Martinez in Barcelona. She looked at this LC-PUFA. This really means, this axis here is omega-3 fatty acids, basically, okay, omega-3 fatty acids. And this is the amount per brain. And what we're plotting here is postnatal age in weeks. Most people think in months, but there's a year right there at 52 weeks, and then there's 2 years. So this is the first 2 years of life. And what you see immediately here is that omega-3 DHA rises rapidly and continues to rise through 2 years, and even past 2 years, as I'll show you on the next slide. So that's normal term birth right there. We're going to call that 0. Anything before that is supposed to be in utero. Anything after is after birth. And what I'm also showing is preterm infants. And this is a preterm infant that was born at about 27 weeks and would have been less than 1.5 pounds birth weight. What you can see is in this last third of gestation, the last trimester, that this omega-3 DHA actually rises in an accelerating rate during that period, and then of course continues to rise through, as I say, 2 years. You also see that the other omega-3s, these are 2 other omega-3s, and this one we're going to talk about at the end, EPA, are actually quite low. This is the structural material that actually makes the cells in the brain. That's what this is doing, and this continues on out to 18 years, and I'll show you that here. This is a similar kind of study that was done about 20 years ago, and plots, again, the DHA along this axis, and out to 88 years of age. The oldest person here is 88. On the last slide, the oldest one there was 2 years. So that very rapid rise is shown in these first couple of points right here. But as you can see, that DHA continues to go up to about 18 years of age, 18, 20, pick a number, and then it stabilizes through life. And so what this tells us is that we are putting on DHA particularly aggressively in the first 3 years, but we continue to put it on through the end of adolescence. Okay. So that's what I have to say about the DHA story. in terms of why it's important for building brains as at least a first aspect. The second thing I'm going to hit is what the recommendations have been from the government for dietary intake. And I note that the very first dietary guidelines was done in 1980 actually, and was prompted by this report here that was published in 1977. And I was struck by the congruence of the recommendations from 1980, which was the first ones, to 2015. And I've made a list here, which actually just the yeses mean that the recommendations were actually present in both 1980 and in 2015, and were basically the same recommendations: more fruits and vegetables, decreased consumption of meat. We can debate that if anybody's interested at another time. We have other things like don't eat too much sugar, don't eat too much salt, and then we have a few things that are a bit controversial. Whereas the fat business is actually a significant controversy, and has been for, I don't know, 60 years. But most of this stuff is, in fact, about lengthening life, and as I like to a little bit cynically say, it's about the health problems of 50-year-old men. So I want to move past that. We had a bit of a break in 2010 when the recommendation was made that women who are pregnant or breastfeeding ought to consume 6 to 12 ounces per week of seafood. Now, seafood is the primary source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. So what I mean by that is omega-3, EPA, and DHA. I just showed you what DHA does in the brain, rises rapidly in the first couple of years of life and in the last trimester. And then EPA is another story. And then there's issues with iron and so forth. But this was the first recognition that we were bringing in pregnant women, which seems kind of strange, but that's the way it is. And so, and that also tells us about the perspective that we have to bring to this. In 2015, we had a nice break as well, where we continued with that recommendation. And I guess for want of time, I won't get into all these details about all these recommendations. You can read about them on the web. But an interesting point that I like to make is about what they call the protein foods. Now, when people say protein, if you're in a restaurant and someone asks you what protein you want, you usually say something like beef, chicken, fish, beans, something like that. When people say protein to me, chemical structures come into my mind. And so there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance there. But if we're thinking about foods directly, that is the foods that supply protein, that's the point of contact between the two. In men, particularly men, our intake of meats, poultry, and eggs, particularly meats, is above recommendations. Notice the recommendations are not zero. They're not down here someplace. This is a function of age, by the way. These are ages down here. So you can see that there are significant ranges in recommendations for meat, but we're overdoing it. It's not quite the case with females, but it is the case with men. And you'll also see down here on the seafood side, we're way below recommendations for seafood. And this is the place where you get omega-3s. And that's true with females too. So this emphasis has been on a shift in diet, a shift from meats, poultry, and eggs to seafood. But we're not talking about 21 meals of seafood a week, even though I actually think that there are places where they eat 21 meals of seafood a week and it's not a problem. But we're really not talking about that. We're talking about 2 meals a week, 2 to 3 meals of seafood a week, substituting for some of these others. And it turns out that education programs are effective in bringing people along. I've been involved with a group, and this is a little bit something that would have goals that are similar to the first 3 years group. It's a seafood. I'm connected with this group. It's called the Partnership for, it's called the Seafood Nutrition Partnership, or seafoodnutrition.org. The website is right there. And it has been around for about 5 years. It derives nonprofit funding from a bunch of players in the seafood industry. So you should know that, but somebody's got to pay for it. There's nothing like that, nothing like this seafood education group. And basically it's devoted to popularizing, educating people about the recommendations of independent panels about consuming more seafood. We've run a number of teaching events where we've gathered together groups of consumers and taught them how to cook seafood, because that seems to be one of the barriers. This fellow right in the middle here at the time was the executive chef at the Boston Hyatt, and he created a bunch of dishes for a family of 4 for less than $10, and taught these low-income moms and grandmoms from a public housing project in Boston how to do this. And we were particularly struck by one of them who and I'll put the quote up here. I'll even read it because I love Jackie. I wish I was taught the importance of good nutrition, especially seafood nutrition, for my children's brain and health. After attending this nutrition education workshop in our community, I now make sure my grandson eats seafood at least twice a week, and he loves it. And Jackie has come to a couple of our events, and she usually tears up when she says this. So just getting folks to really think carefully about what they put on the plate is a real victory, I think. And we've actually studied the omega-3 status, and that is whether omega-3s in folks that go through this education actually improve. And it turns out they do over a 4-month period. 4 months after the education program, they actually do improve. They do go back a little bit, and perhaps we got to think about how to re-educate them here or give them a little booster so they stay with it. But clearly we've got a program which is doing something. Okay, so now I want to hit something on whether omega-3 DHA improves child development. And omega-3s, I have to tell you, are probably the most studied nutrients or even biological molecules in all of medicine. There are well over 24,000 studies. I say well over because that 24,000 was a count a couple of years ago. 24,000 studies on omega-3s in various ways. And so it's not easy to sort that out. I guarantee you I haven't read them all. And so one has to do some picking and choosing based on who has experience and what these and the way the questions are asked. So I'm going to pick out just 2 things to without overloading you on scientific stuff. This study came from the late great Sheila Innes, who left us too early a couple of years ago in her early 60s, unfortunately, in 2014. And as usual, she designed a study which was really very revealing. So she supplemented pregnant moms with omega-3 DHA or a placebo. So this was not a fish study; it was a study of a supplementation. The only way you can do a what we call a double-blinded study, that is a study where neither the participants in the study nor the investigators know what group the person is in order to limit bias, is to do it with supplements. You can't. If you substituted fish, everyone would know that they're eating fish, and so then you risk some scientific bias. So this was a supplement study. She looked at toddlers at 14 and 18 months and found that they were, as she put it, at higher risk of not being in the highest quartile for developing language, that is, words understood and words produced. In other words, toddlers whose moms did not receive omega-3 DHA were much less likely to excel. Now, yeah, I had to let that roll around in my head a little bit, and I came up with another question for myself. What big problem might they not solve? What big problem might there be that doesn't get solved? So let's see. Okay, and so that's one study. Now I'm going to give you some information on a couple of the most important functional studies, and this is about vision. Now, I want to really emphasize that visual acuity development in infants should say, is a measure of nerve development. So when we talk about the development of vision in kids, we are studying something which is a real outcome. That is the way that kids gives the sharpness of their vision. How well can they see? Let's say on an eye chart. But that is an indication of nerve development. That is, it is an indication of how well their brain is developing too. And also I will tell you that that this kind of development of visual acuity is not the kind of visual acuity that one corrects with glasses. I am sitting here talking to you wearing glasses right now, and I'm wearing glasses because my eyes focus close and not far away. That is, I'm nearsighted. You don't correct that kind of that kind of a deficit in, or I should say, children that are nearsighted, and everybody is born nearsighted, is not corrected by glasses. It is corrected by nerve development. So that's what we're measuring here. This is a study that was published. This is not just one study. It's actually a conglomeration of several studies. We call them meta-analysis or a meta-regression that was published here in 2005. Actually, I replotted it in 2016 to illustrate a couple of points. And what this study is it looked at a bunch of groups. 243 infants enrolled in 4 different studies, and each one of these points is a separate group that was in one of those 4 studies. And I want to point out that better vision is down, so it's finer ability to read. Read is not the right word for kids. Finer ability to see, and so you'll all be familiar with the concept of 20/20 vision, and so that's what's called the Snellen chart. And so this is 20/20 vision right here. And so kids are born, they're all born up here someplace. They're all born at 50/20 or 55/20, something like that. And what we're going to do is head down to 20/20. That's where this is going to, that's where normal vision should be. And what we find is that the duration of, and let's just call this omega-3. That's the easiest way to say this for the context in this presentation. The longer the kids had omega-3 over the first year of life, measured at 1 year of life, they were all measured at 1 year of life, the better their vision. And you can see there is a clear dose response. So the kids that had 0 omega-3 were way up here, and the kids that had the most omega-3, whether it was from human milk or it was from infant formulas that had omega-3 added to them, did much better and at 1 year of age. So they were at let's say a 20, we'll say 30/20 versus 55/20, and so that's a huge improvement based on simply consuming a certain amount of DHA over time. So to me, this is a very compelling plot. There's another one that was published, and this was a single study that was published in 2004, and was an extraordinary study that I thought should have been basically the front half of the New York Times when it was published, but in any case, it didn't get as much press as it could have. This is a similar study, but this is not in kids who were not in kids who were consuming formulas or breast milk. These were in kids who were breastfed up until 6 months of age. So all of them were breastfed up to 6 months of age. And then the study occurred between 6 months and 12 months of age. So in that last year. And those kids were randomized to baby food, not formula, but food. And that baby food either had DHA added to it, omega-3 added to it, or not. And when the kids came in, and this is the same story, lower is better visual acuity. You want to be lower in the scale. When the kids came in, their visual acuity was the same. By 9 months, the kids who were consuming the omega-3 baby food were already developing faster in their visual acuity, and that means their nerve development, and that means their brain development by 3 months than the kids who didn't have omega-3. And by 12 months, they got exactly the same result. remember, this is a double-blind study, so nobody knows what group these kids are in, right? So this is basically a fair test. And these kids, through the last through that period, that 6 months to 12 months of age, were consuming about 3/4 of a jar of baby food per day. So think about that. Mom picks one baby food off the shelf, and you get to be in the black bar, or she picks the other one off the shelf, and you get to be in the clear bar, in the white bar. That's a big deal to me, and that's against all other that's with all other conditions, as far as we can tell, the same. And the difference, by the way, I didn't mention this. The difference, here's that Snellen chart everybody's familiar with, that big E at the top, that the optometrist shows you and the optician shows you. And that basically, this difference right here is 1.5 eye lines down the eye chart. So these are the omega-3 kids, and these are the regular kids. Basically, that's about what the difference is. So this is not only a clear effect, it's a big effect. Okay, so that's what I want to say about direct measurements of nerve development and brain development. I won't tell you about the other, I don't know, 23,998 studies out of 24,000 studies. That's why I say I have to pick and choose. I do, however, want to hit this other thing, which I think is quite important, which is the question of depression. So the psychiatrists have, I think, rather quietly been studying omega-3 fatty acids as a treatment for depression. Now, it's hard to believe, but it's already, I think, about 10 years, and I'm forgetting the exact number, that there has been a recommendation by the American Psychiatric Association in their practice manual to use omega-3s as at least a secondary therapy for folks that are presenting with major diagnosed depression. So these are folks that are diagnosed with by a professional as having been depressed, as being depressed. So that recommendation has been there for quite some time, yet it has not penetrated to the vast majority of practicing psychiatrists. It's important to remember that omega-3s are really come with little to no side effects, and so it's hard to believe that one would not want to go in that direction as a insurance policy, let's say, against deficiency. Now, I have two slides that have far too many words on them, but I'm just going to call your attention to a couple of things. In medical science, we think about very elementary preclinical, very biochemical kind of science, and we think about also clinical tests. That is, the randomized, controlled, placebo-controlled, double-blind trial. And medical evidence for quite some time, about 20 years now, has been ranked in terms of the strength of its evidence. And remarkably, I always like to point out that these animal and laboratory studies that I tend to specialize in are way at the bottom of the scale. And as one goes up, you'll see now randomized controlled trials are near the top, and then what are called meta-analyses and systematic reviews, which are based on these randomized studies, is actually at the top of the pyramid, which then get converted to clinical practice guidelines. But it's the meta-analysis. It's really the last bit of science that's at the top. And what I'm showing, and what I've cut and pasted, that you can read it at your leisure, because I want to go into too much, but what you see is meta-analysis, meta-analysis, and meta-analysis of depression studies showing that omega-3 PUFA intake are associated with lower risk of depression, that they're associated with, and that not only associated with, but that providing a certain kind of omega-3 fatty acid, and that's the EPA one, the one that is very low in the brain. We know that EPA gets into the brain, but we don't particularly know exactly what it's doing in the brain. But the data just seem to be very clear, and they just seem to be coming in the same study after study. And these meta-analyses, which are going to be up at this level, this the highest level of medical evidence are showing that these omega-3 fatty acids are in fact effective against depression. I have one other slide which is even busier than the last one, but it really, I just sat down to try to pull out all the meta-analyses. I'm not even sure I got them all, but there's 6 on here. A couple I've repeated from the last slide. There's 6 on here that all basically say the same thing. They're all pointing, whoops, I'm sorry, I goofed. Okay, they're all pointing in exactly the same direction, that omega-3s are good for depression. Now, we are here a first 3 years group, and this does not apply directly to kids in the first 3 years, but it does apply to moms. Postpartum depression is a big deal, and while these studies are not directly of postpartum depression, there's no particular reason why they're not. They're simply strong evidence for the efficacy of omega-3s against depression. And of course, when mom is feeling better, when mom is in a good mood, that's got to be good for the child. We also, in our group, I'm sure, would not be ignoring gestation. The first 3 years are important, but the first 9 months are important too. So we appreciate that as well. Okay, and this is another technical view, and if there's technical people on the call, they will recognize something that we call a forest plot. And this forest plot comes from meta-analyses, and it shows that when this EPA is greater than 6%, the studies put them all together, and you see that it favors omega-3, that is favors that doses of favors consumption of omega-3 to improve depressive symptoms, and the bottom reinforces that notion of omega-3s. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I'll say a few words about seafood facts. I'll be glad to be interrupted at any time because I like to tell a story that I gave a talk at the Smithsonian a few years ago that lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes, and I didn't take a break, and I hate to say nobody left. So I'm glad to be interrupted when anytime one wants to interrupt me. How do you implement some of this stuff? And there's a lot of misconceptions out there, even among nutritionists, about certain concepts, and I'm just going to hit a couple of them. One is farm versus wild seafood, and the question of whether you get good stuff, good nutrients out of farm seafood versus wild seafood. And the dietary guidelines in 2015 addressed this question, and it addressed it in a form which is basically shown on this slide. This is adapted from the report. It turns out that some farmed fish are actually lower in the omega-3s and really nutrient profile compared to the wild versions. So these dark bars are the farmed ones, and these hatch bars are the wild ones. But other ones, like salmon and trout, are actually richer in omega-3s, and that surprises a lot of people. The reason why they're richer in omega-3s is because the folks who are farming them are taking care to be sure that those are very well-nourished fish. And in the world of animal food production, and this applies to virtually every animal, being sure that your animals are well nourished defines what the food coming from those animals will be composed of. And so it's not simply, you can't simply say, look, I don't like farm stuff, I want to eat wild stuff. Well, I'm all for wild stuff, but there's only so many fish in the sea. That could be the topic of another seminar, webinar. But farmed is actually pretty terrific for some fish. I wish it was better for catfish and crawfish, but at least we are bringing that concept to the fore. The dietary guidelines, I won't read this whole thing, but the dietary guidelines recommended to the food industry that as it produces animal foods, that nutrient profiles in the farm species should preserve nutrients similar to those of wild-caught seafood of the same species. I'd like to think that is something we ought to do for pork and chicken as well, though we don't, and that's just a long story. But at least this is the principle that has been at least expounded now. So another question I get about seafood, we never get very far down the road before somebody says, what about mercury? So I'm going to preempt that question. And I'm going to show you a U.S. government report that I was really not involved with, though I knew the people who were putting it together, and I know the people, and I was sort of following it as it went through. And this was a question of what the effects are, the net effects on IQ. That is, we have a nutrient profile in fish that has omega-3s and minerals and vitamins and all, and just almost a perfect package of nutrients. Throw in some vitamin C and you probably do have a perfect package of nutrients compared to some of these environmental contaminants. Mercury is one. There are some others that are relevant too. When you hear a story that that some fish are the highest in are high in mercury, you have to ask yourself, high compared to what? And it turns out that those stories invariably are high compared to other fish. Well, that's a little like saying that there's a tallest person in the room. There's always a tallest person in the room, but that doesn't mean that when the tallest person walks under a trestle, they're going to hit their head on the bridge. So the question really is, are they high compared to effects that we might see, negative effects that we might see in humans? And these are complicated plots that I'm showing right here. What they basically are showing, in fact, I'm gonna go to the next slide because it's easier to talk about one of them. This is albacore tuna, which so this is consumption of albacore tuna at 12 ounces per week, and this is what I like to say is normal, which is the amount of the number of IQ points. This is IQ points now in the kids with mom consuming, let's say, albacore tuna. And what we see at 12 ounces a week, and we'll just take that as a 0 point, if mom consumes no fish, that child is later on in life is going to be down by 3 IQ points according to this modeling and according to what I think is the best data we have. If you go to much higher levels, even up to double that, you still have a major advantage in IQ points compared to no fish at all. And these, I think, are, in my judgment, and I am the one talking right now, are the best and most compelling evidence. I also put this plot down here, and this is an EPA plot. The environmental, we talk about 2 EPAs in these presentations. One is the omega-3 EPA, and the other one is the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency develops guidelines for toxicology connected to all kinds of basically any environmental contaminant. And their recommendations or guidelines actually are multiplied by a factor of, I should say, divided by a factor of 10. So they are usually referring to a level which is much lower than any kind of a level of mercury that would be related to a reduction in, let's say, test scores in older studies of mercury. Okay, well, I'm pretty much out of time if I want to get any questions here. And so, So Natalie, should I keep going? We've got about 10 minutes left. Do we have a lot of questions, or I can stop there and take questions? Or what do you think?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that have come through, and I'm trying to determine if you've already answered them or if people caught the answer or not. But from Anna a few minutes ago, she's asking, is DHA the same as omega-3?
DHA, the answer is mostly. DHA is an omega-3. So omega-3 fatty acids, there's really 3 of them. EPA and DHA are the active ones. They are the ones you find in fish. They are the ones that you find in fish oil supplements, other marine oil supplements, algae supplements. We like to distinguish between EPA and DHA as omega-3s and the plant omega-3, which is called, it's a long, complicated word, alpha-linolenic acid, and ALA we call it. And that omega-3, your body has to convert to EPA and DHA in order to be active. It's a little like nutritionists recognize that when you eat carrots, you get this orange stuff called carotene, and that has to be converted to vitamin A. It's not active on its own. Your body has to convert it. It's more effective to take vitamin A than it is to eat carrots for eye health and the other things that vitamin A does. And it's more effective to eat DHA and EPA than it is to take these, let's say, the kind of plant omega-3s, ALA, that you find in flax and other kinds of oils and foods.
Okay, great. I think that certainly clarifies for us. And also, just to point out, those of you who attended the general session with us last week, we do see DHA and you said EPA? Am I using that right? Okay. We do see those marketed on infant formulas as well. So last week, Dr. Brenna, we were talking about you know, the importance of breast milk and the nutritional benefits and properties of breast milk, but then also formula and being educated and helping parents to understand the differences between formula options that are out there and just being educated on those options. And so we do see that marketed on some infant formulas as well, to be having those.
It's DHA primarily that's in formulas. In fact, EPA is not added to, I don't think it's added to any formulas at this point in the United States.
Okay.
It's possible it's snuck in, but it was originally just DHA, and that's for the reason that DHA is much higher in breast milk than EPA.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you. So just a comment here from Jess, and we think maybe you've answered hers there, but she says, fabulous webinar. Any notes or comments on the deficit's potential contributing risk to perinatal depression, or is it more often presented as a secondary therapy? And she says that you answered her question there. And then can infants who are moving to complementary food, so around the age of 6 months, be fed soft seafood? So is it recommended that we, feed babies fish, grilled fish, salmon?
So I'm going to answer a slightly different question, which is when parents of children ask me that what they can feed their kids that will supply omega-3s, I point out that we now have eggs that are from chickens that have good omega-3 nutrition, and so they put those omega-3s into the eggs. So a little scrambled egg. I mean, I'm trying to remember. There's a couple of brands of eggs, and they were all over upstate New York when I was there, and so that's one possibility. Can you feed soft fish? Be careful of bones. Give the kids a little bit of fish. Get them acclimated. This whole story that kids tend to like things if you feed it early. So that is a good idea. That would be the way I would go. Just be careful if you feed any fish, whether there's any bones. Mash it up and make sure there's no bones in it.
Absolutely. Great. So in thinking about the preparation, and what would be appropriate, the consistency. So wonderful. Well, those are the questions that I see at this time.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So you can keep talking for a few minutes. If for the rest of you on there, if you have any other questions, please go ahead and type those in.
Okay. So I'll keep going. So we hear a lot about this idea of omega-6 to omega-3 balance, or omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. That concept was brought to the fore in the public mind probably in the 1980s. It was discovered in the 1960s, but brought forward. And I like to show a slide. And this is from this fellow Ralph Holman, who I mentioned had come up with the omega-3, omega-6 idea. And what he did in the very early 1960s was do a series of studies in which he gave various amounts of omega-6, and that's omega-6 over here, against a background of this, let's say, the omega-3 fatty acid that's in flax. So I just mentioned that one. That's the plant one. So the plant one is actually, and it's not well labeled here, but this is what a scientist calls it, 18,3 omega-3. And what Ralph showed in his study was that at very low levels, of omega-6 in the diet, we actually have a good capacity. These are rats. This is a rat study, but humans work the same way. We have a very good capacity for synthesizing DHA and EPA. That's these two guys here. And you can see it's quite high here. This is in liver lipids. This is where we synthesize DHA and EPA. It's quite high. But as that omega-6 goes up, the omega-3 goes down, and you can see it comes down to about half its level. And some of these oils that most of the oils that are available in the Western world these days actually have us out here someplace with respect to the linoleic acid. So this is creating a demand for EPA and DHA higher than it probably had been before industrialization. All these oils that are very high in omega-6 are actually seed oils that are the product primarily of industrial production. It's not a bad thing I don't like to bash industry ever. It's not a bad thing to produce inexpensive food. People have to eat, but we also want to keep an eye on the composition of food and how that affects our health. And this is merely a point along those lines. The industry now, in the last 20 years, this is a very highly well-kept secret, has created many different kinds of oils, all that might have the same description. So I'm showing here, if you say I eat soy oil, I always have to ask which soy oil. If you tell me you eat sunflower oil, I have to say which sunflower oil. See, there's 3 soys I have here. There's actually a 4th one I didn't put on. There's 3 sunflowers here. And everybody knows, everybody knows that olive oil is healthy. Well, so I've got olive oil on here. One of the things you notice about olive oil is this omega-6 bit. That's that little red thing here. Look at how small that is compared to some of these other oils like this sunflower oil, which is just huge. It's much, much bigger. Same thing for soy oil, much bigger. But what we also have in the supermarkets now are what we call high oleics. And the high oleic oils, if you look carefully at the circles I've just shown, the high oleics look very much like olive oil. I like to say that that the plant breeders have taught soybeans and sunflowers to make olive oil. That's not quite true. And GMOs always come up at this point. Soy has been a GMO since the 1970s. It's not anymore GMO because it's this. This sunflower oil has been used. It's basically this one is all the sunflower oil in the United States. Basically, you'd have to go to specialty shops to get anything else. And that change from here to here has happened in the last 15 years, right under our noses, and nobody noticed. So that's another point. And this is a good thing for omega-3s because it reduces that suppression of omega-3s by omega-6s. I'll skip this one for want of time. This happens to be a high oleic sunflower oil. High oleic sunflower oil from a place called Wegmans, which is a supermarket in the north. It's got a reputation for, let's see, we're in Texas, so HEB. The nicest HEBs are like Wegmans. And they're selling this high oleic sunflower oil. And I think that this omega-6s that have gone up dramatically over the century, this is from 1909 to basically, this is the whole 20th century, to 1999. They've gone up dramatically because of these oils. And now I think they're coming down again. We have a little bit of evidence that that's true. Oh, good. I'm at the final slide. So almost final slide. And so we think Americans are eating too little seafood and should consider substituting 2 to 3 meals a week. And I've shown you a whole bunch of stuff about where omega-3s, DHA, and EPA specifically are important for building brains and retinas. I didn't say as much just at the end here about these high oleic oils, olive, avocado, and others. Avocado just looks a lot like olive oil naturally, and that's a good thing to reduce your demand for omega-3s. And then I always like to end by showing folks that you might remember that slide about a half an hour ago that showed a little tiny kid, a little preemie who was less than 1.5 pounds, 545 grams, in fact. And that is my older daughter, who's now 27. And she actually, when she was a baby, she weighed less than that beer that she drank a few seconds after that photograph. So she's now my drinking buddy. And so I've been in this as a scientist, but also as a dad. And that's part of my forever interest in this stuff. Case closed.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And wonderful to see this picture too of your daughter. She's healthy, you know, and
Yeah.
right. Like we think about miracle babies, and wow, incredible, incredible connection to bring it home here. A couple more questions here. Does it matter how the fish is prepared as far as the nutrient properties remaining high in value?
So that question does come up. I think that pretty much they do. Some people will say that that the nutrients go down significantly. I don't think that it's significant enough to make a difference. I think if you probably put it on a fire and chart it like a northern grilled barbecue, maybe that would reduce nutrients a bit, but for the most part, it doesn't make any difference. Let's just eat fish.
Just catch it straight out of the river and eat it like sushi, raw.
Yes, that's why dolphins and dolphins and whales and sea lions have such big brains and are so smart, because they cut out the middleman.
And would it be the same recommendation for a pregnant mom as far as what you were recommending about what to actually eat for the omega-3, same supplements, kind of fish there?
Yes, the recommendation. So we actually agree. Everyone agrees on 90% of fish. 90% of the fish that are available in the marketplace and that are eaten by Americans are all agreed upon that pregnant women should consume 2 to 3 fish meals a week. There are a few that are in controversy, and one of the things, and this is a good group to mention this too, one of the things that tends to get said is, well, don't eat too much albacore tuna, or don't eat too much of some other kind of tuna. And the controversy there is that, well, they are the higher ones in mercury, but the question is, what does high mean?
Yeah.
And yes, it is higher, but is it high compared to any kind of an effect that we can measure? And the answer is no, it is not. And I know that for a fact, and I've talked to the EPA guys, and they just say, well, we're going to assume that fish has no nutrients in it and is just a source of mercury. Mm-hmm. Well, when you assume that, then you're going to get results like that. So my answer is, mom should eat, which by the way is the answer from the dietary guidelines. Mom should eat a variety of fish and not worry about whether she's going to get a little bit of what some folks say is the wrong kind of tuna, because I see no disadvantage there and nothing but improvement for her developing child and herself.
Wonderful. And also, in my experience from working with pregnant mothers and being pregnant twice myself, I would probably get sick of the fish before I would get any kind of mercury level that would be toxic to me, just because when we're pregnant, we have that heightened awareness and the sense of smell. And, we sort of want those things that are good for our babies. So our bodies are kind of built to do that.
It sounds right to me. I mean, moms have to be careful about what moms eat. I mean, one can say, okay, well, don't eat too much sushi. Well, the reason, you got to be careful about food poisoning, right? So, I mean, no, it's not a bad thing to cook things. I mean, you cook it, it tastes better when you cook it, but it also makes it safe. So poach your salmon and you're set. This kind of thing. That's and the other thing is that I don't know that we've really in nutrition come to grips with the notion of exactly what pregnant moms should eat. We tend to say, don't eat anything.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to say, don't eat this, don't eat that, don't eat this, don't eat that. So when do we actually say, do eat something?
Yeah.
So this is another thing which requires some development.
Absolutely. And is there any literature out that shows that a child could catch up if there was a deficit as far as the DHA or the DHA benefits?
Yeah, I think there is some, and remember, these can be long-term studies. So if I say that there isn't really good data, I only mean to say that I don't know of anything that says no. It's just that the kind of levels of evidence that some people want to see maybe are not met. What we know is that if you have no DHA and then you start at any time, you're better off later on. I mean, the message is a little like the inverse of smoking. Quit smoking whenever you can, and then it'll be better, no matter when you do. So eat fish whenever change when you can.
Yeah.
And don't insist people eat 2 to 3 fish meals a week if they're not eating any fish. Get them started. Get started on a half a fish, on one. Get started. Just don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, absolutely. Any information on children who are fed by a tube, if they have tube feeding, or is that formula that's going in there, or the food that's going in there? Would it be the same?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question. Oh boy. You may or may not know that all little preemies, not all, but the vast majority of them, are actually fed like that, and fed their fat like that. And I've been fighting battles about that for some years. These are little tiny ones. That may not be what this individual has in mind, but this is a medical thing now, really not a nutrition thing. And several of us have been battling with the U.S. FDA, as you might know, as you probably don't know. Europe has 6 or 7 or 8 different choices for doctors to use for IV lipids, whereas the United States, up to 2 years ago, had exactly one. And then they approved a second one, which is much better. And I think they should even move further, and a lot of us do think they should move further. But this is a real medical, hospital, doctor stuff kind of thing that we can only advocate for.
Great, wonderful. A couple of questions here. I think people are asking about, is shellfish considered seafood? So on the fish graph, we saw that there were, I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking here, but what is the recommendation around shellfish?
So we say seafood rather than fish because we want to catch everything that comes out of the water.
Right.
So shellfish are a big deal. They're great. They're wonderful. In fact, I like to point out that the chemical composition of some American oysters is almost identical to the composition of the human brain, and we have evidence from the earliest modern humans, which were about 200,000 years ago, that they were eating lots of shellfish in the southern tip of Africa, in fact, and that's an ongoing discussion over how we ended up growing this big brain. Why would you grow a big brain if you didn't have an ample supply of the nutrients that are required to build it? So a lot of us think that in fact our ancestors 2 million years ago found their way to the seashore and started eating seafood, started picking up shellfish off the sea and off the seashore, and that's what was something that fueled the growth of the big brain. So shellfish, sure. Some people are allergic. Obviously, you're not gonna eat it if you're gonna go into shock. But shellfish are great.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you for that definition. I think that answers the several questions that I see here. So you're using the term seafood to define fish from the sea, including shellfish and fish, and that being different than like fresh fish.
Yeah, and that's right. And some of this is even going to include seaweeds. They eat a lot of seaweed in Japan. We eat some seaweed here, and those sea plants actually have some of these fatty acids too. Though I'm not sure what we have in the United States on that, but I would even throw those in there.
And so that leads us to what I think is our last and final question here. I will point out that we're over. If you guys need to hop off, go ahead. But we are appreciating your time so much, and this is a wonderful expertise. So the last question I see here would be recommendations for vegetarians. And so I think maybe that third branch of the omega-3 that you were talking about that comes from plants, maybe with the conversion or seed plants. What are your thoughts on that for vegetarians to get?
Sure. So I want to distinguish between an ovo-lacto-vegetarian, which is what we usually think of as a vegetarian, compared to a vegan.
Right.
An ovo-lacto-vegetarian can consume, as I said, these omega-3 eggs or eggs in general. An ovo-lacto-vegetarian can consume milk that is fortified with DHA from a vegetarian source. And what my usual advice to vegetarians and vegans is first and foremost to stay away from these very high omega-6 oils, because they will shut down the ability of the body to create these long-chain PUFAs that come out of seafood, and I showed you the plots on that. I could show you more. They will shut it down. And I personally don't recommend veganism. I think it's not a great idea for the brain. I think there's some evidence that it's not a great idea. We can battle that out a bit if we need to. But for sure, no doubt, without question, stay away from high omega-6 oils.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Brenna. This has been a fascinating webinar. So much great information. Absolutely loved hearing your presentation. The research, the literature is incredible. And so I don't know if we can top this expert webinar this year, but but we do have one every month. So so hopefully we can bring the same quality and content to you guys for the rest of the year. We'll go ahead and end now. For those of you who are still on, I will be sending a follow-up email with the survey for today's topic, and you can respond to that. When you finish and complete that survey, you will receive your certificate of attendance. So if you have any other emails, any other questions, feel free to send those over, and I can get in touch with Dr. Brenna to answer any other questions and move forward. You guys have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Brenna.
My pleasure. Best wishes to everyone.